out! You stole my son's money, and now you want my house?
In 2 hours, you'll discover who actually saved this house.
My mother-in-law slapped me in front of 23 people on Christmas Day. The room went silent, so quickly that I could hear the old grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. My cheek burned, but the pain was nothing compared with the look on my husband's face. Daniel was not angry with his mother. He was terrified, because he knew why I had remained silent. Margaret pointed toward the front door and said, "Get out of my house. You have taken enough from this family." Nobody defended me. Not Daniel's sister, Catherine. Not his uncle, Robert. Not one of the cousins who had eaten the food I spent 2 days preparing. They all watched as if I were a stranger who had wandered into their family celebration. I picked up my coat, looked at Daniel, and said, "You have 2 hours to tell them the truth. If you don't, I will." Then I walked into the snow. My name is Olivia Bennett, and until that Christmas, I believed silence could protect the people we loved. I had been married to Daniel for 8 years. He was kind, intelligent, and generous, but he carried one dangerous weakness: he could not bear to disappoint his family. Margaret had raised Daniel and Catherine alone after their father died. She had worked 2 jobs, saved every dollar, and eventually bought a beautiful old house outside Boston. The house became the center of the family. Birthdays, graduations, Thanksgivings, and Christmas dinners all happened beneath its high ceilings and faded crystal chandeliers. To Margaret, that house was proof that she had survived. To Daniel, disappointing his mother felt like destroying everything she had built. 3 years before that terrible Christmas, Daniel opened a small construction company. At first, the business did well. He renovated kitchens, restored historic homes, and earned a reputation for honest work. Margaret proudly told everyone that her son was finally building something of his own. Then Daniel accepted a huge commercial project. The client promised it would transform his company. Daniel hired more workers, leased equipment, and borrowed money to purchase materials. But halfway through the project, the client declared bankruptcy. Payments stopped. Bills did not. Daniel tried to hide the problem. He told me everything was fine while he used one loan to pay another. By the time I discovered the truth, his company was nearly $900,000 in debt. I remember sitting at our kitchen table after midnight, surrounded by bank statements and overdue notices. Daniel covered his face with both hands. "My mother can never know," he whispered. She told everyone I was a success. I wanted to be angry, but what I saw in front of me was not a dishonest man. I saw a frightened one. He had made reckless choices, and then allowed shame to make them worse. "No more secrets between us," I told him. "We face this together, but you must promise me you will tell your family when the time is right." He promised. That was the first promise he broke. I worked as a financial analyst, so I knew the company could still be saved if we moved quickly. We sold our second car, canceled vacations, and emptied most of our savings. I took freelance work at night. Daniel reduced his salary and negotiated with suppliers. But the biggest sacrifice was mine alone. My grandmother had left me a small apartment in the city. It was the only property that belonged entirely to me, and I had planned to keep it as security for our future children. Instead, I sold it and put nearly $400,000 into Daniel's company. I did not do it because Daniel demanded it. He begged me not to. I did it because 42 employees depended on that business. They had mortgages, children, and Christmas presents of their own to buy. If the company collapsed, Daniel and I would not be the only people hurt. For a while, the plan worked. Then Margaret received a foreclosure notice. Daniel had made one decision he had never confessed to me. Months earlier, before I discovered the company's trouble, he had persuaded Margaret to use her house as security for an emergency business loan. She believed the arrangement was temporary and safe. When the company missed several payments, the bank began proceedings against her home. Margaret called Daniel in tears. He told her it was a clerical error. When I learned what he had done, I was furious. "That house is her whole life," I said. "You had no right." "I know." His voice broke. "Please, Olivia, just give me time to fix it." There was no time. The bank had already set a deadline for December 27th. I contacted an attorney named Sarah Klein, who specialized in debt restructuring. Together, we negotiated a settlement. I used the last of my inheritance, along with payment from a major consulting contract, to purchase the bank's claim and stop the foreclosure. The final documents would be signed on Christmas Day, because the bank's overseas representative was leaving the country the next morning. Once the paperwork was complete, Margaret's home would be safe. She would owe nothing. I planned to place the deed in a red envelope and give it to her after Christmas dinner. Daniel was supposed to tell her everything first: the failed contract, the debt, the mortgage, and what I had done to rescue both the business and the house. But every time he tried, fear stopped him. While I worked to protect Margaret, She became convinced I was ruining her son. Catherine helped that belief grow. Daniel's sister had never liked me. She thought I was cold because I discussed budgets instead of gossip. She mistook privacy for arrogance and careful planning for control. When Daniel stopped buying expensive gifts and began arriving at family events in an old car, Catherine decided I was taking his money. He worked harder before he married her. I once heard her say, "No, everything goes through Olivia." Margaret began asking questions. Why had Daniel sold his car? Why had we canceled our summer trip? Why did he look exhausted? Each time, Daniel gave a vague answer. His silence created an empty space, and Catherine filled it with suspicion. By Christmas morning, Margaret believed I had secretly drained Daniel's accounts and pushed his company toward failure. That day, I arrived at her house carrying 2 trays of food and the red envelope containing the preliminary agreement that would save her home. Daniel carried the gifts. He looked pale. "Tell her before dinner," I whispered. "I will," he said. But he did not. The afternoon began peacefully. Children played near the tree. Music drifted from the kitchen. Snow gathered on the windowsills. Margaret wore the silver necklace her late husband had given her, and for one brief moment, I imagined that the evening might end with relief instead of pain. Then Catherine found a bank statement in Daniel's coat. It showed a transfer of $400,000 from an account in my name to Bennett Construction. Catherine did not know the money had come from the sale of my apartment. She saw only my name, Daniel's company, and a large number. She carried the statement into the dining room and placed it in front of Margaret. "Ask Olivia where this money went," she said. Margaret read the page. "What is this?" I looked at Daniel. This was his moment. He stared at the table. "Daniel," I said softly. He opened his mouth, but Catherine answered for him. "She controls all of his money." "I told you something was wrong." "That is not what happened," I said. "Then explain it." I could have exposed Daniel immediately. I could have said that her son had lost the money, hidden the debt, and risked her home. But I had promised him the chance to confess himself. Even then, foolishly, I wanted to protect his dignity. "Daniel needs to explain," I said. Margaret misunderstood my restraint. She thought it was arrogance. "My son was successful before you," she said. "Now he has no car, no savings, and no pride. You stand there in my house and refuse to answer me." "Mum, stop," Daniel finally said. But his voice was weak. Catherine picked up the red envelope from beside my purse. "What is this?" "Another account." I reached for it. "Please give that back." She pulled it away and handed it to Margaret. Margaret saw the bank's name on the documents. She saw her address and the words mortgage assignment. Without reading further, she assumed I was trying to take ownership of her house. Her face changed. "You wanted my home too?" she asked. "No, please read the entire document. You waited until Christmas to steal the roof over my head." "Margaret, that is not." Her hand struck my face before I finished. The sound seemed to travel through the whole house. Daniel stood so quickly that his chair fell backward. The children stopped playing. Someone turned off the music. Margaret pointed toward the door. "Get out." I looked at Daniel. I did not shout. I did not cry. I simply told him he had 2 hours to tell the truth. Outside, snow covered the driveway. My hands shook as I unlocked the car. Daniel followed me without his coat. "Olivia?" "No," I said. "I have protected you long enough. I was going to tell her. You watched her accuse me. You watched her hit me. You said almost nothing." He lowered his eyes. 2 hours, I repeated. "After that, Sarah sends every document to the entire family. And Daniel, if you lie again, do not come home." I drove to a cafe near the highway. It was almost empty. I sat beside the window, holding a cold napkin against my cheek, while Christmas lights blurred through my tears. Back at the house, Margaret expected Daniel to defend her. Instead, he locked the dining room door, placed his phone on the table, and called Sarah on speaker. Then, for the first time, he told his family the truth. He explained the failed project. He admitted borrowing against Margaret's house without making the risk clear. He described the loans, the unpaid bills, and the months of fear. Finally, he told them about my apartment. "Olivia sold the only property her grandmother left her," he said. "That $400,000 was hers. She used it to save my company and protect 42 jobs." Margaret sat down slowly. Daniel continued. "The bank papers in that envelope do not give Olivia your house. They release it. She paid the settlement. After the final signature tonight, your mortgage disappears." Sarah confirmed every detail. She explained that I had insisted the home remain entirely in Margaret's name. I had refused repayment rights and had asked the attorney to make sure no Fuseness loan could ever use the property as security without Margaret receiving independent legal advice. Catherine tried to interrupt. How were we supposed to know? "Olivia never tells anyone anything." Daniel turned toward his sister. "You were not supposed to invent a crime because you did not know the truth. Margaret stared at the documents again. This time, she read every page. The numbers told the story she had refused to hear. My money had entered the company, not left it. My payment had stopped the foreclosure. My signature had protected her ownership. And Daniel's signature appeared on the original loan. Margaret looked at her son. You let me blame her. He did not defend himself. Yes, he said. I was ashamed and I was a coward. For the next hour, the family learned how easily a lie can grow without anyone actually speaking it. Daniel's silence had looked like guilt. My privacy had looked like deception. Catherine's assumptions had become accusations, and Margaret's fear had turned those accusations into certainty. At 7:45, Sarah arrived with the final papers and a representative from the bank. The family gathered in the living room while Margaret signed the release. The bank representative handed her a confirmation letter. Her house was safe. Exactly 2 hours after she slapped me, Margaret called. I watched her name appear on my screen. For several seconds, I considered letting it ring. Then I answered. She did not begin with an excuse. Olivia, she said, her voice trembling. I was wrong. I said nothing. You saved my home. You saved Daniel's employees. And I repaid you by humiliating you in front of the family. Yes, I said. You did. She began to cry. Can you come back? Not tonight. There was a long silence. I understand, she whispered. I told her that an apology could not erase what had happened. I told her I would not return to family gatherings until she apologized in front of every person who had watched her accuse me. I also told her that Catherine's gossip had to stop and that Daniel needed counseling if our marriage was going to survive. Margaret agreed to every condition. But forgiveness did not arrive that night. Real forgiveness is not a door someone opens with one emotional speech. It is a road built slowly through changed behavior. Daniel came home after midnight. He did not bring flowers or make promises. He handed me his phone, his financial records, and a letter accepting full responsibility for the company's debt. He had already arranged an appointment with a marriage counselor. I kept calling my silence protection, he said. It was really fear. And I made you pay for it. That was the first honest thing he had said in months. 1 week later, Margaret invited the entire family back to her house. She stood in the same dining room where she had struck me. I accused Olivia without evidence, she said. I hit her when she was the person protecting me. What I did was cruel, and none of you should excuse it because I was frightened or because I am her elder. Then Catherine apologized for spreading rumors. Her apology was less graceful, but at least it was public. I did not hug either of them. I simply said, thank you for telling the truth. Over the following year, Dana rebuilt his company on a smaller, safer scale. He sold unnecessary equipment, created strict financial controls, and hired an independent accountant. He also began telling the truth before a problem became a disaster. Margaret changed too. She stopped treating family loyalty as permission to ignore boundaries. She never again demanded private details about our finances, and when Catherine began speculating about someone else's marriage, Margaret stopped her. As for me, I learned the hardest lesson of all. Sacrifice without honesty does not create peace. Sometimes it creates the perfect hiding place for other people's mistakes. I had believed that protecting Daniel's reputation was an act of love. In reality, I had helped him avoid responsibility. My silence gave Catherine room to invent a story and gave Margaret confidence to believe it. I was not responsible for the slap, but I was responsible for choosing a marriage where the truth could be postponed whenever it became uncomfortable. The next Christmas was very different. We gathered at Margaret's house again, but this time there were fewer guests and no secrets. Before dinner, Margaret handed me a small red envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, not money, not a legal document, and not a dramatic promise. She had written down every monthly payment she planned to make toward repaying me, even if it took the rest of her life. I closed the letter and pushed it back toward her. Keep the plan, I said, but use the money to build an emergency fund. The house should never be at risk again. Margaret nodded. Then she asked, what can I give you? I looked around the table. Daniel met my eyes without looking away. Catherine remained quiet. The room felt calm, not because everyone was pretending to be happy, but because nobody was hiding anything. Give me the truth, I said, even when it makes Christmas uncomfortable. Margaret reached across the table, but she waited until I chose to take her hand. People often imagine that justice arrives with revenge. A cruel person is exposed, and the room turns against them, and the victim walks away victorious. But that was not what justice looked like for me. Justice was Daniel finally carrying the weight of his own decisions. It was Margaret admitting publicly that fear did not excuse violence. It was Catherine learning that suspicion repeated often enough can destroy a family. And it was me understanding that love should never require silence at the cost of self-respect. My mother-in-law slapped me on Christmas Day, because she believed I had taken everything from her. 2 hours later, she learned that I was the reason she still had her home. But the deeper truth not hidden in the bank documents. It was this: a family cannot survive on appearances, sacrifice, or loyalty alone. It survives when people tell the truth before shame turns into blame, and when an apology is followed by change. That Christmas nearly ended my marriage. Instead, it ended the secrets.